all, and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I look at what's making headlines here in Western Australia by reading through the letters to the editor in my local newspaper, The West Australian. First up this week, where's our food from? 19th of February 2015. We have free trade agreements, so let's back these up with a free choice agreement. Frozen berry recall grows news. Country of origin of all food should be clearly marked to allow shoppers to choose the risk and price we are prepared to pay and quality of product. At the moment, it's a lottery, and this nana is being very cautious. Marilyn Hamilton, Corrine. So what's happened is there's been 18 cases of hepatitis A that have been linked to the consumption of frozen berries imported into Australia from China, one particular brand. And as a result of this, a lot of people are now very concerned about food imported from China in particular and food labelling laws. And there's been a lot of back and forth in the paper with people complaining about country of origin. The main brand involved in this case was something called Nanas, hence the little joke at the end of the letter. Here's the thing. So our labelling laws, universally people think that they are not that helpful. But the problem is that there aren't any better systems out there. Food labelling is difficult because consumers are always confused by what's on the pack, and the more information that is required on there, the more confused consumers get. So consumers tend to want simple indications about whether this food is good for them and safe. The problem with that is that very rarely is that an easy question to answer. These are always complex questions. There has been attempts here to come up with simple packaging that have a star rating for the nutrition in food, and these have always been torpedoed by concerns that it is actually quite difficult to quantify exactly how healthy a particular food is because it's more about where that food fits within your diet. The idea of everything in moderation suggests that there isn't necessarily a huge gap between healthy and unhealthy foods. Also, it's always torpedoed by the food manufacturers who don't like it. But more to the point in terms of country of origin. So the current laws state that every food sold in Australia, basically, bar some tiny exceptions, must be labelled clearly with where that food came from. Now, it depends a little bit on the type of food we're talking about. So basically, unprocessed food, which is usually fruit and vegetables, clearly have to be labelled at point of sale with where they came from. And that's done here straightforward. You can see product of the USA, product of Australia, product of China. Packaged foods is a little bit more complex. One of the major, in fact, the major manufacturing industry in Australia is food manufacturing. And so because of this, it's not always clear, it's not always easy to put a single label on a food to say where it came from. So the current regulations say this. You have to say where the food was produced, that is where it was manufactured. So if a food has undergone a significant transformation, then it will be labelled with and where it was made, and if it was made in Australia, it will also be labelled with where the ingredients came from, predominantly. Now, that's a little bit complicated because they don't have to specify exactly where every single ingredient comes from. I think they generally just specify where the majority of the ingredients came from. The point being that essentially the biggest choice decision for consumers is whether it is an Australian product or a non-Australian product. That's basically it. Or where it was produced if it wasn't an Australian product. So let's say we import, and we do, lots of American food. It will say product of the USA, and it will have their labelling laws, and we can trust that it was produced under their regulatory regime, and it will be as safe as we can expect food from America to be. Having to specify where every single ingredient came from doesn't, to me, seem like it's going to actually help us to make better decisions. The other thing is that consumers aren't particularly well placed to judge the relative safety of, say, Italian berries and Chinese berries. You might think that Italy, being a European country, would have better food safety laws, but that would just be an assumption based on some fairly broad trends, and is not necessarily true. China is a big country, and I would guess that standards would vary somewhat amongst there, and when you want to import that food here, there is actually a fairly strict regulatory and monitoring of food quality. And so simply telling consumers where every ingredient in their food came from, one, would be quite a cost to business because they would then have to include all that information. But it also means that the businesses then couldn't change. So if their supplier, who was supplying them with berries from that goes into their cheesecake, say, if one supplier wasn't able to supply berries for one run of factory, and they had to get the berries from somewhere else, they would then have to change their packaging. And changing the packaging is not as simple as getting, a marker and stuff. Then that involves things like graphics design and printing and all the rest of it. And so there's actually quite a lot of cost with that. And companies routinely change their suppliers around to fill these gaps. And that's why being able to say, an Australian food manufacturer, be able to say this product was made from imported ingredients without specifying exactly what, allows the consumer to say, well, okay, I know it's not Australian, it could well have come from somewhere like China, without having the manufacturer having to specify exactly where it came from in every single case. I think it strikes a good balance. And the other point is that hepatitis A, which is what people caught from this, is a virus and usually occurs in such low quantities on products like berries that even the organisations that screen these things have basically admitted that there is no way that they could have... In fact, they've been testing these and they found no trace of hepatitis A in the berries. Not necessarily because it's not there, but quite possibly because no amount of testing could have revealed it, perhaps. And that's true for any berries, whether it's in China or the berries here. It seems to me that this is one of those cases where you can have as strict food laws as you like, and you're always going to have incidents like this. And I wonder whether... I suspect that this is not a case of anything actually falling, the system being broken, but rather this just being one of those unfortunate cases. But I'll be watching it in the news to see how it turns out. Next up. Triggs and Detention, 19th of February 2015. Professor Gillian Triggs' timing of the release of the Human Rights Commission report on children in immigration detention and her appearance before the Senate committee were two of the most blatant partisan exercises I have seen in recent years. If Patricia Dodson, apologised to Triggs, letters 17th of the 2nd, really believes Professor Triggs' behaviour was impartial, then I suggest Miss Dodson is spending too much time in the company of fairies that reside at the bottom of her garden. Peter West Ellenbrook. The Human Rights Commission, which is an independent statutory body set up here to oversee human rights in Australia, recently released a report. The head of the commission, Professor Gillian Triggs, then came under fire. So the report was into the health, particularly and to a large extent the mental health of children who are being detained in immigration detention here in Australia. So we have a mandatory detention regime for boat arrivals, so any asylum seekers who arrive here by boat are automatically locked up, and that includes anybody, men, women and children. And the Human Rights Commission did a review of the health of these the children who've been detained for seeking asylum here. So these aren't people who've necessarily tried... These are almost never people who tried to sneak in unannounced. They actually generally announce their arrival and then they're put in detention. And the report found that basically health care for children was very low, but particularly mental health. The children's mental health, simply as a result of being locked up indefinitely, because this is indefinite detention, there's no fixed amount of time they spend in there. It is until their case is processed, which often takes years and years. Indefinite detention on children offshore, often in third world countries like Papua New Guinea, undeveloped countries like Papua New Guinea and Nauru, turns out has a significant effect on the mental health of children. Who knew? So up to a third of children, or there's about a third of children have some kind of mental health issues, including self-harm and suicide attempts. I mean, it's absolutely appalling stuff. Of course, the government's response was to say that was basically to focus entirely on the timing of the release of the report. So what the Human Rights Commission basically, there was some scheduling questions about when to schedule this, and they took the decision to not schedule the actual report, the investigation and then the report, at the time that it would perhaps more naturally have fallen, because that would have involved releasing the report during the time of the federal election, and that would have been seen, and they took the view that that would have been seen as being particularly partisan politics. So they took the decision to delay it somewhat so that it was released outside of the normal election cycle. Here's the thing. I would accept utterly that there probably was some partisanship in what the Human Rights Commission's decision about the timing of it. That even though Labour is absolutely blasted in the report and comes off as at least as bad as the Coalition, I would accept that there quite well have been some kind of bias in that. And the reason why I would accept this is probably likely is because I think about the kinds of people who would be attracted to work for the Human Rights Commission. What kind of person would have a passion for human rights and want to work in human rights? These kinds of people probably, I would think quite reasonably, would skew to the left wing. I would suspect that, and they would have to be well educated, they would probably come from upper middle class type families. Most of the people working for the Human Rights Commission, we're talking about professional people. And therefore, a lot of their voting habits, they would tend to be more left wing than the general public. And therefore, the organisation as a whole, no matter how hard they try to be unbiased, is likely to be skewed to the left wing through sheer unconscious bias, shall we say. And so in this case, I would absolutely accept that there probably was some bias in the timing of it, and probably unconscious, but you may argue conscious. Here's the thing, even if that was absolutely true, even if there was deliberate partisanship in the timing of the release of the report, so fucking what? There are hundreds of children, literally hundreds of children, locked up in detention, most of which are offshore in third world countries, indefinitely locked up, and who are suffering as a result. That's not to mention the adults who are suffering less because they're slightly less vulnerable, but who are still suffering intensely. The fact that this is all incredibly well documented in the report means that whatever your concerns about the timing of it, there's still the problem of the fact that that we as a country are inflicting this damage on innocent people. And that, frankly, is unacceptable. Next up. Don't be distracted, 21st of February 2015. The hypocritical outrage coming from our elected representatives concerning the use of tickets and perks given to Healthway astounds me. Ticket-wrought news. Go to any public event in Perth, or even interstate, and you'll see these same politicians and their families enjoying the free entry, lavish meals and other perks far beyond the reach of us mere mortals who voted them in. Enough of this confected outrage which is meant to take our minds away from other shortcomings. The performance of the Transport Minister comes to mind, and get on with what they're paid to do, govern the state in a correct manner. Mike Lloyd, Bull Creek. So the backstory to this is that we have a health promotion body here called Healthway, whose budget is in the millions of dollars, and whose job it is to promote healthy lifestyles to West Australians, so as to affect behaviour change so that we are healthier as a general rule. So this came about, I believe, in the 90s or perhaps the late 80s, when the government banned all tobacco advertising. So we've had a complete ban on tobacco advertising for the last 20 or 25 years. And part of that, one of the main issues was that local sports clubs and other organisations like that were very much involved in the health of children, getting them active and healthy and doing exercise, received a lot of sponsorship from tobacco companies. And so when they had a ban on advertising, these organisations, these community organisations that were doing a great job, and arts organisations as well, were looking at essentially losing a lot of their sponsorship and having to fold. So the government created Healthway, which was to basically provide the sponsorship that the tobacco industry had been providing, but to do so, and instead of promoting tobacco, was going to promote healthy things like not smoking and limiting your alcohol intake and eating healthily and exercising. And so far it's been a great success. All of the independent research that's come out about the effectiveness of it is that all the campaigns they run, the sponsorship they do, actually returns quite a lot of benefits to WA. We are healthier as a result of the efforts they make. And as I say, their budget's in the sort of tens of millions, so it's not actually huge amounts of money for a state government agency. It's sort of modest amounts. But they do, what's recently come out is that there has reports of widespread abuse of the system. So because they sponsor sports and sporting events and art events, theatre and things like that, they get free tickets. And it turns out that a lot of these free tickets have been used by members of Healthway just for their friends and family, just so they can have a good time. The ostensible purpose of the tickets is so that they can entertain other stakeholders and people that they do business with, so that the CEO of Healthway, say, can go to an event, bring along somebody with them, and build a business relationship. As an outsider to a lot of business, to business in general, I do understand that this is how business is done, but I also understand that this is how business is done is also the excuse that's often used for corruption. And it seems to me that the provision of free tickets is basically only a few steps away from just outright corruption. And the letter writer here is absolutely right. I looked into this because I thought, it's a truism. Like, it's sort of mentioned, it's common knowledge, common wisdom that politicians receive all these perks and benefits, and they get free tickets and they get this and they get free booze and wherever they go. And that, of course, made me think, well, is there any good evidence of that? Turns out, actually, there is. I had a little look into this. Turns out this is widespread. And it seems to me so close to being corruption, if not actually corruption, that I can't quite see how you can possibly justify it, other than the fact that this is the way it's done. So, for example, the major football codes here routinely give out lots and lots of free tickets to politicians. Now, the football codes benefit from this. That's why they do it. I mean, absolutely, there's no pressure on them to do it. They want to do this. This is their form of lobbying, is they give away these free tickets so that the politicians come along, so that next time they need money for a new stadium or they need some kind of financial support like that, the politicians are more likely to support them because they've had these good experiences. I can think of no other reason. Well, I can't think of a single good reason why a politician should be allowed to do that. It seems to me that that's a total conflict of interest. These are politicians who, in one way or another, are in charge of making these decisions. They should not be accepting free gifts. It seems to me absolutely absurd. Like, the only reason they're receiving these free gifts is because they're in a position. Retired politicians, I've got no problems with that, but then retired politicians rarely get these kind of offers. And so, yeah, I was kind of shocked at how bad it was. Now, hopefully, Healthway looks like it's in a bad way because it's been run. Hopefully they're going to manage to do something useful, but it looks like the Premier wants to get hold of those tens of $1 million worth of funding and bring it more closely under his control so that he can use it for his pet projects. So it looks like perhaps Healthway is on its way out, which would be unfortunate because it's done a lot of good. Just needs to rein in the corrupt ticketing. Lastly for this week. Gender differences, 25th of February 2015. So an unidentified female teacher has been shown mercy for having sex with an underage male student. Teacher who had sex with boy goes free. News 20th of the 2nd. I wonder if the courts would have shown the same mercy to a male teacher befriending an underage female student who had fancied his strong looks and had wanted to see him naked. Male teachers have been named and shamed even when proven they were innocent, and the reporting student had blatantly lied. Why the double standards in this case? Drew Morton, Ellenbrook. Okay, so as happens with seeming some regularity around the world, a female teacher had sex with a male student and was taken to court, and she was convicted of it. In this case, she was given a suspended sentence, and this letter doesn't make it clear, but there was a lot of circumstances around it which suggested that this was entirely the appropriate decision. So if we put the gender to aside for a moment, because I don't think that's actually relevant. So the situation here was that it was a 17-year-old student who had, and all the evidence presented in court, even by the prosecution, was that the 17-year-old male student had approached the teacher and had befriended her, and that then pushed her to, had asked her at least to send him dirty pictures of herself. He then, instigated him going to her house, and they had sex. She then broke off the relationship with him because she decided that she'd done the wrong thing and refused to engage in sex with him after that, even though he'd asked her a few times. It was only after that, so after she decided that she didn't want to have a relationship with him, didn't want to continue having sex with him, it was only after that she was then arrested and charged and taken to court, at which point she pled guilty. So here we're looking at first offence, as far as I know. There was no suggestion that there was any other prior offending or any whatever, of a single case where a single incident of having sex, that she then had opportunity to continue to abuse this boy, and she didn't. So she stopped of her own volition. What this suggests is not that she's a good person. She isn't. She had sex with a child. That's not acceptable. What it does suggest, though, is that she's less of a threat than somebody who continues to have sex with somebody until they're caught. She stopped of her own volition, which suggests that she is less likely than other offenders to continue doing this. Also, she has lost her job as a teacher. She can't work as a teacher anymore. Too right, that's exactly where it should be. She's also lost here we have a system where you have to have what's called a working with children card. She was unable to get that, so now she has she has somewhat limited range of career, because she now can no longer work in any situation that involves children, not just teaching. And rightly so, this is what should happen. But what it does mean is that there are significant consequences to her, aside from what the judge imposes. So we have first-time offender of good character who engaged in one incident and then voluntarily stopped offending, who is going to suffer, she's lost probably the only job she's qualified for, and all related jobs that she could possibly be qualified for, she's also barred from. All of this suggests that she's unlikely to offend again in any kind of real sense. Also, the child was 17, which means that, not to say that that's okay, it certainly isn't, but on the scale of offending, the older the child, generally the less damage that's done. All the evidence was suggested that the child was a willing participant, although cannot consent in a legal sense, or in a moral sense. And therefore, it would seem to me that a suspended sentence is exactly the kind of punishment we'd like to see. Now, I would like to see exactly the same punishment for that circumstance if it was a male teacher with a female student, or with a male student, or whatever. That this probably represents what I struggle to think of a case of child having sex with a child that could be even less minor than this. I struggle to think about how this case could be any less bad, if you like. That's not to say it's good, it certainly isn't. But that's exactly what needs to be taken into account when we're giving out sentences. And I would like to see men be treated with exactly the same thing. Now, I accept absolutely, like the letter writer is implying, and as most of you would probably agree, that men are treated more harshly. It is assumed that men, by virtue of being men, are more likely to be predatory, to be to fit that more sex offender role, and women generally are seen by the judiciary as being less predatory and less of a sex offender, even if they are committing sex offences. Just in this case, I actually think that the judge got it right. I just wish that they would apply the same standards with men. But then again, I take a sort of a much more rational and reasoned approach to sex offenders than perhaps the average person who writes into the newspaper. Anyway, that's it for this week. I feel quite a bit better having had a rant. It's bloody hot though. I hope all of you in the Northern Hemisphere are enjoying your winter. I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See ya.